Welcome to Ujima Wednesdays. This week, we are learning all about degrowth. This month, we are learning all about degrowth. This week, we're joined by writer, artist, and organizer KC Legacion, who will be speaking about the degrowth movement and giving us an overview to degrowth. So I'll just read your bio really quickly. KC is a researcher, artist, and organizer living in West Philadelphia, a Master's of Environmental Studies candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. The research analyzes social media through the lens of degrowth. He is currently translating this research into a short film set to premiere in September of this year. KC's latest film, American Degrowther, was screened last year at the 8th International Degrowth Conference. As an organizer, he is involved with the web collective degrowth.info, Police Free Pen, and a housing cooperative in West Philly. I'm going to spotlight you. KC, thank you so much for being here, and I hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sierra, for the introduction and for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be here. I'll begin by sharing my screen. I have a little slideshow prepared. All right, great. Yeah, so as Sierra mentioned, my name is KC. I'll be providing an overview of degrowth today. And I will begin with a brief history of degrowth. So degrowth as an idea can be traced back to the environmental critiques of the 60s and 70s found in works like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the Limits to Growth report published by the Club of Rome, as well as The Entropy Law and the Economic Process by Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen. And this last book was a foundational book for ecological economics, a transdisciplinary academic field that is very much intertwined with degrowth. But degrowth as a term was first formulated in 1972 by French philosopher André Gorz when he used the term décroissance in a public debate where he questioned whether or not planetary stability was compatible with capitalism. And since then, degrowth spread throughout France and the rest of Europe, and it garnered more international attention and a formal translation into English in 2008 at the first International Degrowth Conference in Paris. And so as an English word, and as a word in the English lexicon, it's still quite new, which I think is quite exciting. But what actually is it? Well, it's a word with many meanings. It's been called a missile word, a movement of movements, a multifaceted framework, an academic discourse, an umbrella keyword, an interpretive frame, a provocative slogan. But a kind of classic definition of degrowth can be found from Schneider et al., Redding in 2010, who defined degrowth as an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the local and global level in the short and long term. Degrowth can also be thought of as an invitation to ask the following questions, among many others, including how might we relate with each other and the web of life if we did not organize society around the ideology of endless economic growth? Instead, what if we structured society around the principles of care, autonomy, and sufficiency? And how might all aspects of existence transform if we venerated biophysical limits and prioritized the reproduction of life? Some concrete examples of degrowth include small-scale things like community care networks, so childcare, elderly care, urban farms, housing and worker cooperatives, community fridges, community currencies, time banks, composting, bottle blocking, and buy nothing or free item groups. And I think many of these things are things that Ujima is actively doing and actively talking about and organizing around, which I think is very, very exciting. Degrowth is also very much related to large-scale things like some large-scale policy proposals like federal care income, so income for care work, unpaid care work, minimum and maximum incomes, universal basic incomes, reduced working hours, and Green New Deals without growth, and also just sweeping systemic changes, including the abolishment of the prison industrial complex, the seizing of the means of production from the capitalist class, and the expansion of participatory and federated democracies. All of these things are very much related to degrowth and things that degrowthers are actively working towards. Degrowth is not without its critiques, though. Some say that it's too challenging of a word, and in response to this, degrowthers highlight that, some might prefer like post-growth or a-growth, but degrowth is currently the thing that we're centering around because it prevents appropriation by capitalism, just because capitalism is such motivated by capital growth and capital accumulation that degrowth, can't really be co-opted by that. Others argue that degrowth is a recession, but that is not necessarily the case because reducing the GDP of a nation's economy is not necessarily a goal of degrowth. The concept of GDP itself is an actively contentious thing in degrowth discourses. And instead, degrowth can be understood as a transformation. So as opposed to just simply reducing the amount of stuff we produce and consume, degrowth can also be considered, or it also centers around the transformation of our understandings of the economy. Another critique of degrowth is that degrowing everything is not good, but to this, I think nuance is necessary, and degrowth is only aimed at harmful sectors, or it's primarily aimed at harmful sectors like the petrochemical industry, the military-industrial complex, and instead other sectors necessary for life like education and healthcare. These are things that do need to grow or flourish. And finally, another big critique of degrowth is that it's unjust for the global South. And to this point, it's important to emphasize that degrowth is primarily prescribed for rich industrialized countries of the global North, which need to degrow their colonial and exploitative relationships with the global South, and that inequalities across all societies need to degrow. And also important here is to emphasize that degrowth is, since it's a Eurocentric concept, since it's a concept that originated in Europe, and it primarily is a Eurocentric concept. Many degrowth academics are writing and working in Europe. Critics highlight that degrowth runs the risk of perpetuating colonial continuities by becoming this idea that is prescribed by the global North onto the global South. And to this point, degrowthers highlight that degrowth should not be understood as a prescription for the global South, but rather just a supplementary idea to existing Southern ideas and movements that already exist. And ultimately, another thing important to emphasize is that degrowth is not a fixed concept. Instead, it's something that is continually reproduced and recreated with every conversation, publication, and interaction, including this talk right here. And I attribute this to just the nascency of degrowth, right? As an English word, it came about in 2008, so it's still quite new relative. And that being said, though, here is my understanding of degrowth that I'd like to impart upon you all. So I would describe degrowth as an array of ideas and practices that, one, critique societies driven by the pursuit of infinite economic growth, and two, nurture reimagined ways of existence that prioritize socio-ecological well-being. And together, these ideas and practices pursue a number of interconnected transformations that cultivate conditions in which people can collectively create and reproduce their own versions of the good life, all within planetary boundaries. So in terms of degrowth now, what is happening right now in terms of degrowth organizing and action and scholarship as well. So here are just a number of organizations within the degrowth network of networks that are active right now, including Research and Degrowth. They're an international group that is centered around academic research and scholarship. There's Entregroy and Degrowth Vienna. These are two of the many regional degrowth groups centered around the Netherlands in terms of Entregroy, or Vienna in Austria for Degrowth Vienna. There's also degrowth.info, which is an online resource hub that is all about degrowth, and I am one of the web members of degrowth.info. And in terms of here in the States, there's Degrow US, which is an overarching organization made up of smaller chapters that are all about organizing and advocating for degrowth. One of the more active chapters is in Burlington, Vermont, and also Degrow NYC, which if you were here last week, I know Jamie Tyberg was here to speak about degrowth and decolonization, and she is a co-founder of Degrow NYC, and they are doing a lot of really cool stuff in New York. And as a fun fact, I guess, Jamie's actually the person who I learned about degrowth from, and so it's, I guess, fun to be here a week after she gave her talk. In terms of moving forward, here are just some of the gaps I think that degrowth has yet to address or really contend with, and that I think need to be discussed more, or also other things that degrowthers are actively talking about. But first, degrowth and critical race theory. Degrowth, I should have emphasized this earlier. A large part of degrowth is an academic body of literature, and at least in that body of literature, I've yet to see any serious engagements in terms of degrowth and race and racism. And I think that is something that definitely needs to be considered. And to this point, I think Sierra asked me to talk about, what does degrowth look like for people of color who are just getting financial stability? And I think important here to emphasize is that degrowth, a degrowth society or degrowth transformations should create a lot of social support for people of color, and especially people who are just getting financial stability, but also people across classes, as mentioned by, or as evidenced in several of the institutions just talked about earlier, like a time bank, community currencies, care networks. All of these things are support systems that people of color can rely upon or will be able to rely upon in a degrowth society. In terms of the policy proposals that I talked about, like reduced working hours that just frees up time for leisure and play and life as opposed to work, which is something that degrowth is all about. Degrowth is all about slowing down and making sure that there is a time for leisure and in the enjoyment of life. And then finally, in terms of the large-scale policy or large-scale systemic changes, I think all of these will, of course, I would argue have like a very positive impact for people of color, right? Like the abolishment of the prison industrial complex, which is, a fundamentally anti-Black institution created to perpetuate anti-Blackness here in the United States and around the world. The abolishment of that has a whole slew of implications for how people racialized as non-white operate within the world. Other things that degrowth could contend with moving forward, queer theory, that's another thing that I think degrowth hasn't really discussed. Digital technology. So as mentioned earlier, I study social media and degrowth, and that's a perspective that no one has really looked at before. And I think, as digital technology continues to expand, that's something to think about. Strategy, degrowth and strategy is a very hot topic right now in degrowth discourses. And there's actually an upcoming book on strategy that should be published sometime in the next few months that I think would be of interest for everyone here. I believe it's just called Degrowth and Strategy. So certainly keep an eye out for that. Degrowth and electoral politics here in the States, I think, is another thing that I haven't, I think it's, I haven't really seen. Sorry, mine went blank for a second. Since it did originate in Europe, there are a lot of, politicians or people who are actively organizing and running a campaign on a degrowth platform. And I've yet to see that here in the States. And then finally, degrowth and spirituality. And I think it's worth mentioning that at the 8th International Degrowth Conference last summer, there was a whole, that was one of the thematic concerns of degrowth was, how does degrowth concern or connect to the spiritual? And to this point, I want to also emphasize that degrowth is all about transformation across scales, from the very wide, like the global systemic scale to the very intimate personal scale. And to this point, I remember the keynote speaker at that, for this panel on degrowth and spirituality, one of their main points was just looking at grief and how do we handle grief, and how can we handle grief in a more intentional and careful way. And I just wanted to bring that up here. And I think degrowth, to me, is just a very spiritual thing that I found very transformative, since it is, I found it, I guess, just the centering of care, I think, is very transformative in how I've been operating about my life. And I guess I just want to emphasize here that just to bring the personal into this space, right? Like today was like not a good day for me. I was feeling very down, very just downtrodden for a variety of reasons. And what I realized was that I really didn't process a lot of grief that I have been carrying for a while, and I hadn't given myself space for that, and instead was just really just working a lot and just pushing myself to work. And I think kind of ironic that, trying to organize under the banner of care without actually pausing and giving care for myself, and just taking, observing that was, a moment, cried and all that. And I'm very lucky that my partner is here and was able to receive comfort from him. And I bring that up to say that I think, once again, when talking about degrowth transformations and transformation across scale, I think for me, degrowth is all about the centering of care. And so what does it look like to center care in every act of life, in every breath? How can we think about care, and how can we embody care for ourselves, for our communities, for the web of existence as a whole? And I think a large part of that is dealing with grief and thinking about spirituality and thinking about the interconnected nature of existence and relationality with ourselves, other beings, and other more than human beings. And I just wanted to bring that into the space as well. And here is my list of references. If you're interested in checking out any of these things, I'll I'll once again plug degrowth.info. That's the online resource hub that I'm a part of. We have a blog posts or a blog section where we semi-regularly publish new blog posts about degrowth and a specific topic. And we also have a library that people can search. So if you're interested in if there is specific degrowth conversations about a specific topic, you can use that library to check it out. Yeah, thank you once again for having me here. And I'm excited for the Q&A section. I'm very much excited to discussing more about degrowth with you all.
Thank you so much, Casey. That was so helpful and enlightening. Does anyone have any questions at this time? If not, I can get started with mine. Okay, Jim has a question. Jim, do you want to unmute yourself?
I hope this is okay. I don't want to take up too much time. Your presentation is beautiful. It filled me with a ton of questions that have just come up very recently for me, sort of personally and in my work life. So I want to try to think. I have 3 questions to ask. The first is about critical race theory and racism, and our, the white supremacy sort of counterposed male white supremacy is, and I wanted to ask, and this is just the first question, so just if you're willing to think about, to the extent that Europeans have written about colonialization, are there is it useful at all to think about white treatment of African Americans in this country as a form of colonialism? Are there any parallels that could inform our work in seeding, in giving over, raising our global South, quote unquote, our African American sisters and brothers? That's one question. And whether that would offer a way out of the kind of Eurocentric kind of set of limitations. The second is in regard to the police state and police violence. I'm a physician, actually. I work at Healthcare for the Homeless, and my job is on the HIV outreach team. Now, many of the patients that I try to see out on the street are not African American. Of course, many are, but police violence is spread. It's like a machine gun. It's just sprayed across the population. And I'm just bringing that up because it's very difficult not to become demoralized by that, by the impunity with which, even in a supposedly progressive city with, I think, a genuinely potentially progressive mayor, we're months into her administration, and the police are literally driving by homeless encampments in the middle of the day with their windows of their black cruisers up and canines like barking really loud inside the windows. Why? It's only to intimidate people. It's only, in fact, to make people afraid to access the health services that we're offering 2 blocks away at our engagement center. So we have people coming, be afraid to come in to get clean needles, afraid to come in to hear about, Suboxone or methadone treatment. And so more people are dying now than a year ago. Anyway, sorry, I'm a little bit struggling with that, but I really wanted to put that out as a question about where do we even begin to think about defunding? And my last question I already forgot, so maybe that's a good thing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jim, for these questions and sharing some of your stories. To your first question about, if I understood correctly, about race and racism as it relates to colonization, especially in the United States context, I think one post-colonial critique of race and racism is that race is a colonial construct that was created by European colonizers to create a social hierarchy in which there is one group of people that can rightfully subjugate many other groups of people, that being like the white versus non-white, I guess, binary or dichotomy. Not to speak in binaries, I guess, but and so all that being said, I think race as it connects to colonization is that race is once again a colonial construct, and so the process of racializing others is a means of continuing colonial violence and continuing this this creation of a social hierarchy. And I think that is something that is very apparent here in the United States, where we are a country. This is a country founded upon white supremacy, and as we know and have seen time and time again, this is a country that continues to perpetuate white supremacy. And so, yeah, I guess the degrowth critique comes in by highlighting how colonization is also very much interconnected with capital accumulation and this growthism, this productivism, this need to get more and more and more economically. And how do we do that? And I think Jamie, who spoke last time, if you haven't read her piece on unlearning degrowth, I can't remember the exact name, but I know it starts with unlearning, very much would recommend. And she has a point about that, how this infinite growth goes both ways in terms of capital accumulation, but also infinite exploitation of labor, of people, of the exploitation of the people racialized Black who were brought about here under the system of chattel slavery, or the exploitation of indigenous genocide and indigenous erasure that continues to happen today, the exploitation of any number of groups of people, and the exploitation of natural resources. And so this infinite growth is both in terms of capital accumulation, but also just this negative exploitation, this destruction of life. And in terms of your second point about the police industrial complex, I guess, and how to even approach that, I turn to abolition here. And I think, once again, degrowth is all about limits. And I think it's important to emphasize too that the degrowth critique also has its own limits. And I think degrowth is very much an idea that it stands in solidarity with a variety of other movements that seek collective liberation and collective flourishing. And I think it's important here to bring in other perspectives like abolition. And I guess when thinking about how to approach that, I put on my abolitionist way of thinking and acknowledge that abolition, as I understand it, is fundamentally about looking at care and looking at harm, and how are societal structures created to produce harm, and what is the root cause of harm, I guess, oftentimes, and what is crime, and what conditions actually perpetuate crime, and how can we instead create conditions that mitigate the occurrence of harm, or even just eliminate the possibilities of harm. So concretely, like, just looking at a simple example of someone stealing like food from a store, here is a harm created where this person does not have access to things they need to live, and so they commit this quote unquote crime of stealing, and then a police officer could theoretically come and arrest them and perpetuate this violence that is fundamental to the prison industrial complex. But an abolitionist perspective, I would say, looks at how can we create systems that instead give people enough to meet their own material and emotional and spiritual and social needs. And once we meet that baseline, then like where can we go from there? And so concretely, I think like things like a community fridge, right? Like if we have a surplus of things, then how can we invest our surplus into the community itself? And I think that's another thing that is key to degrowth. There's like a French word called dépense, I think, which is all about surplus and reinvesting surplus into the community. And so yeah, I just want to bring that topic up. And so I guess the point here I just want to emphasize is how can we just once again center care in all aspects of life, and how can that centering of care minimize the occurrence of harm, and once harm has occurred, how can we create and cultivate reimagined ways of addressing harm outside of the prison industrial complex, right? Like community accountability, restorative and transformative justice. These are frameworks that exist and have been cultivated and are continuing to evolve. And I think what do those kinds of harm or approaches to harm and approaches to addressing harm look like, and how can we just cultivate that more intentionally? And just to give another concrete example, right? I live in a housing co-op, and in our housing co-op, we have a number of different stewardships we call, which are just, I guess, chores that encompass more broader areas of the house. Like, someone does dishes or runs the dishwasher, I take out the trash every day. And another chore we have is like, we call it the Care Bear, and I was the first Care Bear, and here in my role as a caregiver was one of my first things I wanted to do was just create talk through a community accountability process and talk about how do we all like to be called in when we need to be called in, right? Like if someone does something that's harmful, how should we be called in? Whether that's some people are more comfortable being called in one-on-one. Some people are fine with being called in in a house meeting. And so I bring that up just to, I guess, provide an example of, these intentional discussions of how to address harm outside of, the police force. And I think that's something that is just important. Yeah, and hopefully then those answered your questions.
Casey, do you want to, I'm sorry, Abby, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Casey, just want to say, of course, thank you for being here and thank you for sharing something personal with a whole bunch of strangers. Zoom, super appreciate it. And I hope that you feel better. But what was my question? Okay, so my question was being, I'm on board team Degrowth, all sounds great. But I'm curious to hear the transition process. How do we get there from here? And what are, I don't want to say some of the first steps, but what are maybe some low-hanging fruit steps that you feel are necessary to take, either at an interpersonal community level or maybe higher level, municipal, country, whatever kind of hits you to talk about in terms of scope. What are some places to start?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great question. And to that, I would once again plug the Degrowth and Strategy book that is coming out, because it's all about that question, looking at degrowth transformations and transitions at a variety of scales. And just personally, I tend to look at more of the grassroots bottom-up approaches to transformation. But I'll preface this answer by saying that when in degrowth discourses about transformations, theories of change is a whole body of study. And one framework that degrowthers like to or have engaged with is Eric Olin Wright, who is a sociologist who talks about a number of different strategies to change, some of which include symbiotic approaches, which can be thought of like a top-down approach. So, how can actors seeking transformation work in symbiosis with existing institutions to affect change? So that is, I guess, the electoral route or the policy route. There's also the interstitial approach, which is looking at how can actors of change work within the cracks of existing systems. And I think that is more of the bottom-up approach to theories of transformation. And there's also the ruptural approach. So when in moments of crises that emerge, how can these moments of crises also be seen as windows of opportunity to then push towards change? And I guess the emergence of the COVID pandemic is an example of this crisis that emerged that is continuing to unfold. And in response to that, especially in the very early days of the pandemic, a plethora of mutual aid networks emerged in response to the shortcomings of federal and state actors. And I guess to get to my personal perspective on what can happen is, I think at a very, very interpersonal or just very personal level is how can we reimagine what it means to be human, I guess. And I think this is Sylvia Wynter speaking, who I would also highly recommend engaging with her work. And to answer that question, I think we just have to ask ourselves, what are the current understanding, what is my current understanding of what it means to be human, and how does that relate to systems of harm, and what are new reimagined ways of becoming human that I can think about. And on a very personal level, I've begun bottle blocking, and I kind of have fallen off that practice, but I've been meaning to re-engage with that. And if you're not familiar with that, it's just this process of, and actually, I'm not sure where it is right now, but imagine a plastic water bottle with bits of soft plastic cut up, and then you shove it in with a dowel, and it becomes compact enough to become a functional construction material. And I found that to just be a very spiritual practice, because it makes me sit down and engage with this plastic, right? And I in doing so, I found myself questioning where did this plastic come from? What organic matter, what organic beings died and then over thousands or millennia of years transform into other matter that was then extracted and then produced this plastic. And I guess I just bring that up to say as an example of finding rituals that allow us to question and imagine new ways of existence. Other concrete examples of transitions, I think anything that builds relationships in community. So I think, Ujima's, I know some things that Ujima does is, local currencies or like a time bank. And I think that is amazing because it's all about building community and also building alternative economic relationships and economic practices. And I think that is very, very key because, once again, a degrowth understanding of the economy is all about how it needs and how do we meet our needs and how can we meet needs outside of neoliberal markets and capitalistic markets. And I think practices like a community currency are great because it allows us, it's kind of like an interstitial approach, but it allows us to build economic practices outside of, dollars and instead centered around like the community. And I think cultivating those kinds of practices are really important at the policy level, I think, or the more macro level, I think, pushing for, specific policies like a care income is really, really important just because there's so much unpaid care work that is, the care work that is fundamental to the reproduction of life that is often done by, women and femmes. And I think just highlighting that and uplifting that kind of work through financial remuneration is critical. And that is like a policy that degrowthers are very much organizing around. Reduced working hours is another thing, as I mentioned before, just to give time for more leisure and enjoyment of life. And also personally, I'm very much interested in the technological side of things. As I mentioned earlier, I study social media. And so, I think another thing that I've been thinking about on a personal level is just like looking at, digital tools, right? Like looking at my smartphone and as opposed to just, picking it when I feel like a big feeling or a bad feeling, as opposed to just like picking up my smartphone and just doom scrolling, I find myself like needing to sit down and think about like, what need am I trying to satisfy through the use of this tool? And once I think about that need, I can ask myself, oh, do I actually, is using my smartphone the best way to meet this need? Or is there alternative ways that I can meet this need outside of just picking up my phone and just scrolling? And I guess that is another, very small scale personal practice that I've been trying to embody more. And I think, those kinds of small scale, habitual, cultivating new habits, I think is another thing that is just important when thinking about theories of transformation and these degrowth transformations. And I guess those are the things that I tend to especially latch onto, but that is just my perspective. And of course, there's a bevy of perspectives on degrowth and transitions. I'll once again plug that book. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, KC. I have a couple questions, so please bear with me. My first question, and I'm sorry, would you like me to just ask all the questions at once, or maybe throw them in the chat, or should I ask them one at a time?
I guess asking them all at once and throwing in the chat would be great.
Okay, cool. So I would love to know if there are any, what are some of the general calls for degrowth in the EU that you've heard about, and are, if any are applicable to the US context? Second question, what are maybe 1 to 2 differences between the idea of degrowth and a Green New Deal? I saw that in your presentation that you had kind of alluded to the Green New Deal, but I would love to know if you have any examples. And then 3, why would you say it's important to talk about degrowth as perhaps an umbrella term or a concept, rather than some of the other terms that we're familiar with that this covers, like sustainability, abolition, care work, solidarity economy, circular economies, all those other things?
Yeah, thank you. To your first question, what are the general calls for degrowth in the EU? And here's where I reveal my lack of knowledge in terms of comparative international politics. But I will say, I think, Nina Troy, who was one of the co-founders of Degrowth.info, she is German, and she ran for parliament on a degrowth platform through the Green Party in Germany. And unfortunately, she didn't win, but there was a lot of political will for that kind of work. And I think in terms of the general calls, I would say, all of the policy proposals that we've been discussing are very much at the forefront of discussions for degrowth in the EU. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not the best person to ask or answer things about European politics, but moving on to other questions, some differences between degrowth and Green New Deals. I would say the key difference is the challenging of growthism and the hegemony of this growth ideology. And degrowthers would critique the Green New Deal because they don't explicitly challenge growth. And if we read the proposal for a Green New Deal here in the States, at least, they mention economic growth without like actually challenging this idea of economic growth. And so I think that's a key difference between degrowth and the Green New Deal, just this challenging of growthism and productivism. Yeah, and that's another thing, right? The Green New Deal is all about green jobs and retrofitting infrastructure and all of this, which is great and I think is necessary. But so long as if these calls for green jobs are not met, or not accompanied by calls to challenge this productivism, right? This idea that in order to live a happy and good life, we just need to continually work. I think that is also something that is a key difference between degrowth and Green New Deals. And then finally, this ties into the last response and our last question, and why I think it's important to talk about degrowth as an umbrella term, because degrowth fundamentally is all about challenging this idea that growth equals good. And I feel like, at least in the social worlds that I occupy, that is something that is just so commonplace and so like common sense. It's to bring in Gramsci, it's this idea that's taken for granted, and something like degrowth challenges us to question that and ask ourselves, is economic growth actually good? Is it actually even possible on a planet with finite resources? And so that is something that I feel like a lot of other movements aren't baked into other movements necessarily. And yeah, so for example, sustainability, I think that's something that's not necessarily talked about. And in fact, because that's not talked about, I feel like that is why we see sustainability, this idea of sustainability being co-opted by capitalism, right? Greenwashing is so apparent; it's everywhere. It's because sustainability is like this easy feel-good word that is easy to slap onto something, and therefore it's like green and good for the environment. Where in reality, like something, so long as it is continuous, so long as like a sustainable product is motivated by profit, then fundamentally, I would argue, and I think degrowth would argue, it's not actually sustainable because it's not challenging this ideology of infinite economic growth that is so baked into existence. And in terms of other things like abolition or care work, solidarity economy, circular economies, I guess I would just say, once again, it's that centering this ideology of growth and just challenging that ideology of growth. And degrowthers would talk about like decolonizing our imaginary, decolonizing this growth imaginary that is implanted in so many of us because of the systems of harm that we are inherited and are birthed into.
Thank you so much. Francesca, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
So thank you for those questions and those responses also. Something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is the tension or the relationship between the problems of wealth accumulation and desires to make alternative economies with also the need to calls to compensate people for their time and like for care work, for instance, and the need for disenfranchised communities to build wealth in order to gain access to a lot of things in the way our society currently works. And so I'm curious how degrowth can help us kind of think through that question. Yeah,
definitely. I think I'll return to this idea of dépense, which I'm mispronouncing because I'm not French, but this concept, as I understand it, is all about looking at surplus and what do we do with surplus, whether that be economic surplus or just a surplus of food or surplus of any resource or good. And I think under capitalist modes of accumulation, under capitalist forms of production, the surplus would be reinvested in this capitalist cycle just to produce more surplus. Whereas I think degrowth helps us once again, critique that and understand that there are ways to move beyond that, and instead ways that this surplus can instead be reinvested into the community. And yeah, I think in terms of just wealth generation and how can wealth generation, what does wealth generation look like in terms of disenfranchised communities? I think once again, degrowth fundamentally is also about socio-ecological well-being and cultivating socio-ecological well-being and ensuring that everyone can meet their own needs and beyond just meeting their basic needs can flourish. And I think degrowth helps us center that through, once again, this idea of reinvesting surplus into the community, and also just also prompting reflexivity, I think, self-reflexivity especially. I mean, that's something I haven't really talked about, but I think also a part of degrowth discourse is its need for self-reflexivity about, what social position do I have, and what social position do others in my community have, and what does it look like for me to either reinvest in my community, or also what does it look like for me to exist in community with those around me to meet my own basic needs. And sorry, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yes.
No, that's so helpful. Thank you. That concept of surplus is really helpful. Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you so much. I see a question in the chat from Hendrix. Hendrix, do you want to read your question out loud, or would you like me to?
Hey, yeah, I can say it out loud. Thanks for sharing. I'm sorry I was late, but I'm excited to review the recording and what I missed later. My question is just like how does the degrowth movement measure and define growth? Like, are we talking about like letting go of GDP as a standard of success? Are we talking about because it just seems like, you can grow good things or you can grow bad things. So yeah, I'm just curious, like how the movement goes about measuring growth and comes to the conclusion that growth is a bad thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're very much right there in terms of, growing good things and not growing bad things. And that is fundamental to the degrowth critique. And I guess first, degrowth would define growth as infinite economic growth, and specifically infinite economic growth. And this is the growthism that fuels capitalism. And so degrowth critiques that and acknowledges and highlights that infinite economic growth is impossible on a planet with finite resources, which necessitates alternative economic models that do not center around economic growth. And in terms of measuring growth, this is also where I guess degrowth relates with things like solidarity economies or circular economies, because degrowthers are very much in alignment with alternative measurements of indexes or metrics. So things that look at qualitative things as opposed to like quantity and the quantification of existence. I think degrowthers would very much critique that and instead advocate for alternative measures of success that instead focus around qualitative things like quality of life and happiness. So things like the Happy Planet Index are things that are paradigms that have been proposed in opposition to things like GDP. And that thing it's in the Happy Planet Index, if I remember correctly. It specifically measures things like a country's level of happiness, the quality and robustness of a country's ecological systems. And so degrowthers would instead very much advocate for those kinds of things. And yeah, I also just want to reiterate the point that degrowth is not about degrowth in all aspects of life. It's specifically about degrowth specifically in terms of like the harmful sectors of harmful sectors of existence, like the police industrial complex or the petrochemical industry. These are things that definitely need to degrow. But other things, right? Like other things fundamental to existence, like health and care and education or learning, or alternative things like community-owned institutions or participatory democracy or things like a time bank. These things do need to grow, though degrowthers might prefer the verb deepen or flourish.
Yes, thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions if anyone has one. So I'll take a beat.
Could you say something about social media KC, I just am asking, that was the third question I managed to forget. Can social media be degrown?
Yeah, and here I would, in my research, like one of the core things that like I'm trying to propose or offer is this reconceptualization of social media, as opposed to just being like Facebook or TikTok, right, or Twitter, like these large corporate entities, right? Instead, in my research, I'm breaking down social media into like distinct and concrete components. So things like a social media's business model, its ownership status, its affordances, or the features of a social media. Things like its network topology, the shape of the network of the computers talking to one another. These are the components that make up social media. And once we break down social media into the levels of components, we can then ask ourselves, what are the qualities that each component must have in order for social media to better align with social media, with degrowth? So for example, like a decentralized network topology is something that is much more aligned with degrowth, as opposed to like a centralized topology where, I'll use Twitter and Mastodon as an example, and I'll try to talk about this briefly. But Mastodon, we all know Twitter, right? This microblogging website that you can use to make tweets. Mastodon is this decentralized and federated Twitter alternative. So decentralized meaning that there's not like one singular Mastodon website that is hosted on like a central set of servers. Instead, Mastodon can be thought of like as this universe of autonomous and independent websites that are hosted on a network of servers that are owned and operated by like the website's administrators. And so this alternative network topology and this alternative ownership statuses allow for much more possibilities in terms of how we interact online, right? Because a Mastodon instance can be very, very small. It can be like 20 people, and that kind of like scale just I think allows for much more possibility in terms of it. Just for one, like limits the amount of trolling and just vitriol that is spewed online, because on Twitter, you can theoretically connect with anyone and everyone. And that level of anonymity, I think, can be dangerous and can, in conjunction with like algorithms that prioritize sensationalized content, I think that can cause a lot of harm. And so all that to say, I think we just, in terms of social media and degrowth, I think we just need to think about, what makes up social media. And once we think about that, how can we think about new ways of making social media that are more aligned with collective flourishing and collective liberation?
Thank you. Karen, did you have a question?
I do have one, but I'm also, this being my first meeting, I don't want to mess up the timing of things with where we are. I'm trying to figure out how this whole concept of degrowth could be actually applied in some of the things that Ujima's looking to do. And I'm trying to get in my mind the logic to how to apply this. So bear with me, because it's still a bit fuzzy. I'm thinking about what one area, because I'm a business person by original career path. And this whole idea of helping minority majority communities grow their businesses. Is the way we would apply degrowth in this, not in how much revenue they generate or how frugal they are with their expenses, but rather in the degrowth away from economic growth would be caring for employees to ensure that they get $15 at least minimum wage, or they have a wage. We would care for them through our business activities so that they could actually have a good quality of life with their income that they were earning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that does make sense. Can I just jump in here really quickly and tell you, Karen, that we have already thought of that. And I would suggest that you go to our website, ujimaboston.com/standards, where we list our 36 business standards for businesses to join the Alliance. One of them, which is a living wage.
Right. I've looked into some of that, but I'm trying to get my own logic process straight in my head so that when I think about degrowth, I think about it in the way it's intended. It's wonderful that Ujima has already done that. It's just that I was kind of fuzzy and confused in my head. But thank you.
Yeah. I'll briefly answer this, and then I have to, I'll return to social media because I would be remiss not to mention this. I think the values of sufficiency and autonomy are important when thinking about degrowth in like a business context. Sufficiency, thinking about, you know, what is like the maximum or the minimum amount of revenue that is needed that a business needs to generate in order to reproduce itself. And then past that, how can a business not pursue more growth, but instead, once again, with this idea of surplus, you know, past a certain amount of revenue, how can this business reinvest into the community somehow? And in terms of autonomy, I think, you know, what does it look like for workers to gain more autonomy over the business they are participating in? And I think something like worker co-ops are really important to talk about or think about here, right? You know, where the workers are also the owners of their institution. And I think things like that are very important to think about in terms of the business context. And then I guess the last thing I'll leave with, because I know there's more things happening, but in terms of another social media that I've studied that I think is very relevant and I think could be really useful for Ujima. I'm not sure if Ujima has engaged with Decidim, but Decidim is just this an alternative like social media platform that is centered around facilitating participatory democracy. So in terms of like functionality, there's things for it's all about facilitating, you know, community-driven initiatives and, you know, voting processes. And anyway, I'll leave the link. Y'all can look at it on your own accord. But anyway, thank you so much for having me, and it was a pleasure. Hopefully, it wasn't too fuzzy. But yeah, very much enjoyed talking with you all. And yeah, thanks again for this space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, KC, for joining us. Super excited to have you. I'm going to end the recording now because we're done. Everybody say goodbye to YouTube.